brief what's coming up. There's more, as you know, and you always can check the website. So today we're very pleased to have Catrina with us. She works for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which a lot of us may not be familiar with. It's a bipartisan, nonprofit policy research organization dedicated to advancing practical ideas to address the world's greatest challenges. And if you look at the subject areas they cover, it's really quite amazing. Climate change, on and on and on. So they were actually ranked #1 think tank in the United States, 2016, 2018 by the University of Pennsylvania. So just to give you some sense of their significance. Catrina is a program manager and research associate for the Transnational Threats Project at the center. And she analyzes global terrorist activity and irregular activities of countries such as Russia and Iran, and obviously domestically as well. Before joining the center, she worked as associate policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. She's conducted research at U.S. Treasury Department's Middle East and North Africa office. And she's also at the Phillips Merrill Center, Johns Hopkins. She's got a concentration in military history, strategic studies, international economics. So she's fairly well versed in some of this terrain. And I really appreciate her taking time out of her probably very busy week and very busy day to be with us. So please welcome Catrina.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. So I'm looking forward to talking about this. I'm going to run through some of the data and analysis that my team's been doing, but then I want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions that you might have, discussion. I know that this has been a very hot topic and a polarizing topic, and there's a lot of information and misinformation out there about it. So excited to talk about it tonight. Let's go ahead and share PowerPoint. Okay. Not having my slides moving. There we go. So just first, a quick overview of what I'm going to run through tonight. First, I'm just going to start with sort of an overview of the work that my team has been doing at the center and the definitions that we're working with. That's one of the big areas that I think there ends up being a lot of confusion and buzzwords thrown around when we're talking about what is terrorism, what is a far right terrorist, what is a far left terrorist. So just laying out the definitions that we're using. I'm going to go through some of the data that we've compiled, looking at trends in the number of attacks and plots conducted by domestic terrorists, the targets and tactics that they've chosen, and then also just a quick run through of our most recent data update looking at events in 2020 so far. So that 2020 data covers January through August, including a lot of the big protest demonstrations over the summer that really gathered a lot of attention. Everything ranging from, militia groups appearing at these protests to the president calling for Antifa to be designated as a terrorist organization. So we'll talk through that, what's actually been happening, and then we'll just conclude with a couple big issues and implications that we should look at going forward. So just as a little bit of background on what we're doing, our team has been doing a comparative analysis of the terrorist threat from different types of groups in the United States. We previously did this also for Europe, but the bulk of our work since about February or so, we've been looking domestically. So we were actually already starting this analysis when it became the big hot topic. So that was convenient in terms of timelines for putting the data together, at least, I can say. But we really wanted to look at it in a data-driven way. I think there's a lot of conversation from people that's very politically driven, trying to identify who is a terrorist, what is a terrorist act. And so we compiled data on terrorist attacks and plots in the United States dating back to 1994. So initially we compiled a data set that ran from January 1st, 1994 through May 8th, 2020. And so that data set had nearly 900 incidents recorded in it. Our most recent update covered the period from January 1st to August 31st, 2020, to really zoom in on what's been going on the past year, and to look at who poses the greatest threat and in what ways. So to start out with the definitions, as you can see here, we defined terrorism as the deliberate use or threat of violence by non-state actors in order to achieve political goals and to create a broad psychological impact. So it's really important to note that when we were compiling incidents for this data set, the incident had to meet all components of this definition in order to be included. So if the person committing the act was not a non-state actor, if it was, for instance, one of the instances in which we've seen police forces use violence, that was not included. If we could not ascertain a specific political goal or motive for the incident, or it was a non-political goal, say someone who was motivated by revenge against a person for a personal matter, that wouldn't be included. It had to meet all of these components. It's also important to note that we were not looking more broadly at hate crimes, even though there is often overlap between what is a hate crime and what is terrorism. However, hate crime is a much more inclusive category, including many types of crimes that are not violent. So things like graffiti could be a hate crime if it's motivated by someone's personal identity, whether that's racial, ethnic, gender, sexuality. But if there was no use or threat of violence, it was not included. Similarly, we were not looking broadly at instances like riots or looting, particularly in looking at 2020. We did see a lot of looting, but that was largely carried out by apolitical criminals who were taking advantage of a lot of mass gatherings, particularly around the protests that were happening over the summer. And so that was not a political motive, it was not included. Similarly, I just want to be clear that we also were not broadly categorizing and tracking peaceful protests. Actually, there's an organization called ACLED that's done a really in-depth study of all of the political demonstrations since May, and they found that 95% of protests were peaceful. And then there's a lot of variance in what that other 5% actually consisted of in terms of what violence was committed. But so what we're looking at here in no way delegitimizes the right to peaceful assembly and peaceful demonstration, or any of the political motives that were advanced through the protests that we saw over the summer, particularly in the wake of George Floyd's murder. We're looking very specifically at violence to achieve political goals and send a psychological message. So as we were coding this data, we categorized it into one of 5 broad categories of ideologies. So I have 4 of them up here that you can read through. The 5th was more of a broad other category, which tended to be for people who had very specific single issue focused political goals for their action. So an example of this is a man who staged an attack in Washington, D.C. in the early 2000s, motivated specifically by an opposition to specific farm-based policies that had been passed that he disagreed with, but was not part of a broader ideology. And so, for the most part, the types of terrorism that we've seen in the US since 1994 have fallen into one of these first 3 categories: far right, far left, or religious. There's been some limited ethno-nationalist terrorism, which we've largely seen stemming from motives that relate to things like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or certain diaspora communities in the US, particularly groups like the Haitian community. But for the most part, there's a very small handful of those incidents. The majority fall into one of the first 3 categories. The 3rd category, religious terrorism, though, as you can see from the definition, it's broadly defined as violence in support of any faith-based belief system. All of the events that we coded in our data set were attacks or plots committed by Salafi jihadists who were inspired by groups like the Islamic State and al-Qaeda. And so throughout our analysis, we use the terms religious terrorism and Salafi jihadist terrorism interchangeably, but it's important to note that in the broad field of terrorism studies, religious terrorism could be furthering any faith-based system. So overall in the US, the biggest threat we found over the past couple decades has come from far-right terrorists. And so who are these? Some of the big groups include white supremacists and other paramilitary anti-government groups. So some are more organized groups, such as Adam Walken Division or the Base. Others are much more dispersed networks. That's actually something that comes up a lot. I think that a lot of times governments or law enforcement or even people looking at the terrorist threat, they want to be able to say, okay, which group is the biggest threat and how do we target this group, disrupt this group's activities or finances. But for the most part, extremists in the US are following this, what they call a leaderless resistance model, where they are very decentralized, very loosely organized, though still following the same ideology, much of which stems back to earlier white supremacist writings, things like the Turner Diaries, and others who, through using the internet or various online platforms that extremists use to communicate, to recruit, to share information, including tips on tactics to use, they could often be sort of inspired individuals, very much like what we see in Salafi jihadist attacks, with people being inspired by activities or information from groups like the Islamic State and al-Qaeda. We also, in addition to white supremacists, we also see a threat from broad anti-government groups and individuals. So that includes the sovereign citizen movement and the broader militia movement. The militia movement particularly stems from incidents like the seizures at Ruby Ridge and Waco in the early 90s and has really evolved over time. It tapered off a bit in the late 90s, but really saw a resurgence around 2008, around the election season. And a lot of groups have been very much empowered over the past several years. We've also seen the emergence of the Boogaloo movement, which is either categorized as right-wing or kind of in this other category. It's a group of anti-government extremists, largely mobilized online, a very diverse set of ideas and beliefs that bring them to the movement, but the commonality is that they're pushing for a second civil war in the country. They're opposed to government, and they're willing to carry out violent acts in order to bring about this second civil war. So these are the ones that you might have seen, in the news wearing the Hawaiian shirts at protests, coming with their guns. It's part of this broader, originally internet-based movement. So these are the main threats that we see from the far right. Others that we've seen in the data set from the far right include groups like incels, involuntary celibates, who are typically younger, heterosexual men who feel rejected by women, who hold anti-feminist beliefs, often radicalized on the internet, and who are motivated by this rage against society and against women in particular. We've also seen the growth of the QAnon conspiracy theory over the past couple of years, and particularly last year and this year, we've seen some individuals begin to act on some of those theories advanced by the figure Q, which alleges that there is a secretive cabal of pedophiles, including many prominent Democrats, behind a shadowy conspiracy in the country, which is obviously not true, but we're seeing that as an emerging threat as well. So as I mentioned, we also have a lesser threat in the country from far left extremists, as well as Salafi jihadists, again, largely inspired by the Islamic State and al-Qaeda. So on the left, at this point in time, the main threat is coming from anarchist groups and self-identified anti-fascist extremists. They, for the most part, are committing acts against property, as we'll see in a little bit when we get into it, a lot of explosives or arson attacks. One of the notable incidents here, up until this past year, the only incident that had a fatality associated with it recently from someone who identified as an anti-fascist, the fatality being himself, was Willem van Bronson, who attacked an ICE facility and tried to explode a propane tank there before being killed by authorities. He's been embraced as a hero by many on the far left, who call for violence to overthrow what they see as a fascist state, or a lot of anarchists who are just opposed to formal systems of governance overall. And then Salafi jihadists, there have been various attacks over the years. Obviously, the biggest being 9/11, but many inspired attacks since. Most notably recently was the shooting in Pensacola committed by Mohammed Saeed al-Shamrani. This was the first directly foreign-linked terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. It was recently proven that he had ties to al-Qaeda and was actively in communication with them before the attack, as opposed to most of the other Salafi jihadist attacks that we've seen in recent years that are much more people who are inspired by their acts, their propaganda, or in loose conversation online, but not direct involvement. So now getting into a bit of the data. So this chart shows just by percentage the percentage of attacks and plots each year from 1994 to 2019 committed by terrorists in these different perpetrator orientation groups. So as you can see, since 1994, overwhelmingly, the majority have been committed by far-right extremists, particularly in the 90s and in recent years. In the early 2000s, we saw a larger increase in far-left attacks. At that point in time, the main groups operating on the far left were animal rights extremists and environmental extremists. So we had a lot of attacks there that were specifically targeting lumber facilities and others that were seen as causing harm to the environment, as well as attacks against universities and scientific researchers, particularly who are using non-human primates in research around cancer and AIDS. But that type of activity really tapered off by the late aughts. So then that's percentages. Here's just charting out by the number of attacks. What's really notable is that not only do far-right terrorist incidents make up the largest percentage of attacks, particularly in recent years and in the 90s, but the number has actually been growing. So as you can see here, in 2017, there were actually even more far-right attacks and plots in the US than in 1995, which had been the year at the peak of the previous wave of far-right terrorism, culminating, of course, in the Oklahoma City bombing, which up until 9/11 was the deadliest terrorist attack on US soil. Now, of course, the second most. And so despite a dip down in 2018, we see that terrorist activity, particularly on the far right, is on the rise in recent years, which is very concerning, starting from about 2014. Looking at the most frequent targets, we see left-wing terrorists often targeting government, military, and police personnel and facilities, as well as businesses as their main targets. A lot of that is really property and location damage. A lot of incidents of arson or improvised incendiaries and explosives. on right wing, just skipping over to the right side of the table, the primary targets that we've seen are private individuals and their property, most of whom are targeted due to their race or ethnicity. And second most, religious institutions. Religious institutions largely being mosques, synagogues, and African-American churches. For religious terrorists, while the majority have been government, military, and police targets, there's also been a pretty even distribution between private citizens, businesses, and other infrastructure targets. And what we see that really stands out for religious or Salafi jihadist targets is that unlike targets from far right or far left groups that are really chosen specifically to send a specific message. So for instance, a right-wing terrorist attacking a synagogue or a left-wing extremist attacking a government facility. Because religious extremists often seek to send a broad message to the American public, their target selection is often much more indiscriminate. And then we also broke out by weapons, finding here that left-wing extremists were most likely to use, again, explosives and incendiaries, particularly in these property damage focused attacks. Religious attackers had a much more even mix across different categories, particularly focused on guns, and then what we classify as melee weapons. So that includes basically any sort of handheld or hand-to-hand weapon, largely things like knives and other bladed weapons or blunt weapons. For right-wing extremists, again, we see a large number of explosives and incendiaries, as well as, again, firearms and melee. But as much as it seems like their selection differs across the different ideologies, when we narrow it down to just the weapons used in fatal attacks, so attacks with one or more fatal victims, we see that overwhelmingly, firearms are most used in fatal terrorist attacks, regardless of the perpetrator's ideology. So that's the orange on these pie charts. And so remember before when I said that we're seeing an increase in the number of terrorist attacks in the US, and that's pretty concerning? This is the number of firearm background checks in recent years by month. For this, we use background checks as reported by the FBI as a proxy for gun purchases. And gun purchases are at an all-time high, with a very steep increase in recent months in the first half of 2020. And so as you can see here, the blue line is just the number of monthly firearm checks when someone goes to try to purchase a gun. And then the orange line is seasonally adjusted. So setting aside what time of year people tend to buy guns most often, this is just sort of evened out what the number of checks that are happening across the year. And so you can see on the right side of the graph this huge spike in recent months, including culminating in the summer of 2020. So lots of warning flags going off, especially amid the currently very polarized climate in the US. And so we had put out all of this work initially, and then we decided to take a much closer look, particularly after the events of this past summer and a lot of the attention that was being given to domestic terrorism threat in the US, to really kind of sort through the noise and figure out, based on hard data, what was going on and who over the past year has actually posed the greatest threat in the US. So we looked and we found between January and the end of August 2020, that there were 61 incidents that we classified as terrorist attacks or plots. And so of these, 41 were committed by far-right extremists, 12 by far-left extremists, and 4 each by Salafi jihadist-inspired individuals and individuals with other motives. So for the sake of this analysis, that other category is the people who adhere to the Boogaloo ideology that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So this anti-government movement seeking to start a new civil war. So again, despite a lot of the kind of push around the threat from Antifa, the demonization of protesters and demonstrators who were exercising their First Amendment rights, the overwhelming number of terrorist incidents so far this year, up through the end of August, have still come from far-right extremists. That said, there has been an increase in far-left activity. In 2019, there were only 3 violent far-left incidents as compared to 12 so far in 2020. And so we definitely see an increase there, but it's not nearly at the same level as far-right incidents. What we're actually seeing there is what in political science we talk about as a security dilemma. And so the idea typically is applied to countries. So how it goes is that if you're country A and you don't trust country B, and then you see that they're arming up and really increasing their military capabilities, you're going to assume that they're doing that so that they can attack you. And so then you're going to enhance your capabilities in order to defend yourself. But now say that country B was only doing that in the first place because they thought country A was going to attack them. And now they see country A arming up more, and so they have to arm up more so that they can continue to defend themselves. And so you get sucked into this spiral where both sides fear a threat from the other, and so they continue to arm and to militarize until it's basically just, waiting for a spark to be thrown on to ignite the fire between them. And especially as we've seen a lot of action being carried out in the streets this year, particularly with counter-protesters clashing with protesters, with paramilitary groups coming to demonstrations ostensibly to provide security, and of course coming heavily armed. We're seeing this security dilemma sort of play out in real time in the American streets as each side doesn't trust the other and kind of expects that some kind of big conflict is going to break out. And based on what people have seen in terms of online chatter and online conversation, each expects that the other side will be the ones to start whether it's another civil war in some communities or just broad mayhem in the streets. Each side feels they need to protect themselves, and then that spills over into violence, especially when individual actors decide to commit attacks. So here we just mapped out those 61 incidents that we tracked across the year, where they're happening across the country. And so the point here is that, these things aren't just a problem that happen, in New York or Los Angeles, in the coastal areas. These incidents can happen across the country. And as we look at that security dilemma, as we look at far left and far right extremists responding to each other, coming to otherwise peaceful demonstrations heavily armed because they've seen the other side coming heavily armed. This isn't just happening in one place. This isn't just extremists in Portland seeing armed individuals at the protest and then deciding to escalate. This is, someone in Texas seeing on the news or seeing on the internet that someone's heavily armed in Portland and then escalating in Texas, or events happening in Wisconsin and then people in California responding. And so it really is hard to predict where tensions will continue to rise because they really are responding to events across the country, particularly as these sorts of things dominate the news cycle. So then we also just broke out weapons and targets used by the far left and the far right over the past year. And so the interesting thing here, as you look at it, again, the far left continue to overwhelmingly use explosives and incendiaries. A lot of these are sort of improvised incendiary devices, things like Molotov cocktails, as well as we actually see on the far left an increase in the use of firearms. Much of this is sort of a response to a lot of the right-wing armed presence at demonstrations. So for instance, the shooting by Michael Reinl earlier over the summer, who was a self-identified Antifa activist who brought a gun to a protest because there were so many armed paramilitary groups coming there as well. So we see that escalation there. What's interesting on the far right is that we see a huge increase in vehicle attacks. Previously, looking at the past 6 years as we've seen this increase in far right activity, there was only one vehicle-based terrorist attack, that being in Charlottesville. But over the past year, the first portion of 2020, we saw a big increase in vehicle attacks, 11 different incidents that we identified as terrorist incidents using a car, a truck, or an SUV to ram typically protesters or other demonstrators to send a political message. It should be noted here too that other researchers have actually noted over 100 incidents of vehicles maybe or maybe not purposely driving into protests in 2020. But in order for us to include it in our data set, we needed to be able to have reasonable evidence of a motive. So reasonable evidence that it was intentional for the driver to drive into the protest and that they were motivated by political reasons. So for instance, there have been some cases where it was an accident, some cases of intoxicated drivers who didn't mean to do so. But in cases where we could prove a political motive, they were included, and we saw a sharp increase there. So similarly, on both the far left and the far right, we saw a notable increase in the number of attacks that were specifically targeting demonstrators. This is something that, in past years, there might be one or two attacks targeting demonstrators that previously we had grouped in with private individuals. But looking at 2020, we broke it out into its own group because it was so outstanding in the data. So from the far right, these were overwhelmingly attacks targeting Black Lives Matter protesters, particularly with vehicle attacks and with threats or attacks from firearms, people who came armed to a protest. On the far left, the attacks or threats against protesters or demonstrators were largely against pro-police demonstrators, pro-Trump rallies, and in one case, a threat with a gun against anti-abortion protesters. And so here we're really seeing how quickly extremists are able to adapt to new circumstances. So obviously, COVID has radically changed how people in much of the country are going about their lives. But the emergence of these public demonstrations has really presented a big and easy target for extremists who want to send a message, and they've really enhanced this politically charged environment. It's also notable how easily accessible these weapons are that we're seeing being used. So if we go back to the weapons, the increase in vehicle attacks, obviously it's very easy for someone in the US to have access to a vehicle. Given gun control laws in the US, it's pretty easy to get your hands on a gun. And these other items, things like knives or explosives, often improvised explosives, many of these are very easy for people to gain access to, for people to use. And we've really seen them take advantage of that opportunity over the past year, especially. So wrapping up, one of the big things that terrorism researchers have been concerned about is violence in the lead up to, surrounding, and after the 2020 election. So actually, when we first scheduled this talk, we purposely wanted to do it after we hopefully knew the results of the election, and so now we do, thankfully. And also, we did not see any massive violence around the voting process or after the announcement of the winner being President-elect Biden. We did see a lot of celebration in the streets of major cities across the US, but we really didn't have any major violence. There were some scuffles, and I know that there are some protests, demonstrations scheduled soon. We did see, in places like Phoenix, as the Maricopa County votes were being counted in Arizona, a lot of people turning out to protest in favor of counting all of the votes, buying into a lot of these far-right, largely QAnon-fueled conspiracy theories that the election was being rigged or stolen. We saw people appearing at some counting sites reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot in the year 2000, around the Florida recount, of people saying that they were observers needing to observe the votes being counted. But despite these demonstrations, we haven't really seen the sort of violence that a lot of researchers were worried about, which is good. But it's not over yet. We continue to see a lot of conspiracy theories, and especially as litigation moves forward, as President Trump has not yet acknowledged the results of the election or conceded his defeat. We continue to see a lot of fuel being added to the fire, a lot of conspiracy theories for people who are unwilling to accept the results of the free and fair election. There was just a couple days ago the arrest of a man in New York who had made comments online and made plans to attack public demonstrations and talked about trying to assassinate Joe Biden. So I think that particularly as we move into January and the inauguration approaches, we will continue to see a lot of plotting, potential action around that and around this narrative of a stolen election. But some of that will operate on a bit of a delay, in part because many extremists are waiting to see what pans out with a lot of this legislation, and also because executing these types of plots takes time, it takes coordination. And so we may continue to see that in the coming months as a big threat. We also will likely continue to see a threat sustained through the Biden administration. There's been a lot of conversation, particularly from some of the paramilitary groups on the far right, including the militia groups, looking at sort of their fear that this will be an overwhelming socialist takeover of America, and in particular fear around gun control policies that the Biden administration could enact. And for a lot of that subset of extremists in particular, one of their biggest fears related to a lot of the conspiracy theories that they ascribe to surrounding the New World Order and the threat from the government revolves around this idea of the repeal of the Second Amendment or the government coming to take their guns, which leads into the second point here, which is that looking at all of this data we have on the weapons most commonly used, especially seeing that firearms are most often used in fatal attacks, we have sort of a double problem. One is that stricter gun control could potentially limit the amount of fatal terrorist attacks we have, given that they're largely coming from guns. It's very easy to acquire guns in the US. However, doing so would also likely spark a major backlash, especially from a lot of these anti-government far-right groups. And moreover, while this could avert many attacks, we still see the sustained threat from other types of easily acquired or improvised weapons, including homemade explosives and vehicle attacks. And so something like gun control, while it will help, will not solve the problem by itself. What we really need is to be able to expand out the bottom-up intelligence collection that law enforcement agencies across the country are able to collect. So in some of the major cities, so in a place like New York, you have a whole department that's looking at intelligence collection and counterterrorism. But as we saw on the map that we looked at before, this really is a widespread threat across the country in both urban and rural areas, coastal cities, Midwestern cities. This could be anywhere, especially as we see a lot of radicalization happening on the internet, a lot of tactics sharing or idea sharing on the internet. And so we really need to build that capability to collect intelligence and to disrupt attacks before they happen across the country, as opposed to foreign-based terrorism, where we really rely on for instance, intelligence sharing with foreign countries, allies like the UK or France. In this case, it really does need to be bottom up, coming from communities. And in that case too, also working on, educating communities on the threat, talking to people about particularly misinformation or disinformation that they're encountering online, especially as people are spending so much more time on the internet as we're at home with COVID. Really having people able to recognize disinformation when they see it, and to recognize warning signs in their friends and loved ones who might be exposed to some of this material that helps them to radicalize, so that they can recognize that, help to prevent that, and recognize warning signs if they need to. Which then leads into the last point, which is the importance broadly of being able to combat extremism on digital platforms. So extremists of all stripes use various encrypted and non-encrypted platforms to be able to communicate with each other. And that's, at this point, in the age of the internet, always going to be the case. One of the biggest things, though, that can be done to disrupt a lot of their efforts is really to combat their operations on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these sort of mainstream social media platforms where they're able to easily spread their message and recruit others. Because, while most of us are on platforms like that, most of us are not on these very obscure encrypted platforms that they're using for internal communications. And so they really rely on social media to be able to recruit new people, and they rely on the algorithms on these social media sites to draw more people in. So for instance, if you view one extremist militia or QAnon group on Facebook, suddenly all of your recommendations are for similar groups, and you're really sucked down this rabbit hole into this whole spiral of radicalization. And so it's really important, and a lot of the tech corporations have been doing a lot of really good work on this, trying to find ways to both remove extremists from their platforms and also adapt algorithms that are designed to show people more of what they're interested in, to not inadvertently help to spread the radicalization that ends up aiding these groups and networks. So with that, I will wrap up. And I am happy to take any questions that folks have.
Yeah, and I think we can, people can just unmute themselves. We don't have a huge group. Usually it seems to be not chaotic. So let's try that without having to use the chat room. So just respect your neighbors, and please don't everyone unmute themselves all at once.
Should we just go ahead, or are you going to call on us?
No, go.
Just go ahead.
You raised your hand. Go right ahead.
Okay. I was really surprised to see how equal the amount of firearms was represented on both the left and the right. It seems to me that visually, most of the things that I've seen on television, of course, the ones that you see armed are on the right. Is it that the ones who are armed on the left don't display them?
So one thing to consider here too is just, so in those pie charts where we're looking at the percentage using the different weapons, that is looking at percentages. It's not looking at the number of incidents. And so the total number of far left incidents is much lower than far right incidents. So for instance, in 2020, where we did see a pretty significant increase in left-wing activity, there were still only 12 attacks or plots attributed to far left actors, as opposed to 41 from far right extremists.
So it's a percentage of what they...
Oops, I think you went muted. I missed what you were saying.
I said, so it means that it's a percentage of the things they do, not the things of the universe that are done that way. Okay.
Yes, exactly. So a percentage of those 12 attacks.
Right. Okay.
So it's still a pretty small number. And again, I would say in 2020 especially, a lot of what we've seen is happening sort of against the backdrop of a lot of these big demonstrations. Sometimes there might be something like a shooting at a demonstration, or these vehicles driving into demonstrations, but overwhelmingly, these protests have been peaceful, and they've just been people exercising their First Amendment right.
Thank you.
So, yeah, we want to be careful that people aren't conflating the two, but also recognizing sort of the opportunity that such large-scale demonstrations pose to extremists who want to co-opt them for their own purposes, or choose them as a target of attack. That looks like Robin. You're raising your hand.
Actually, this is Robin's husband, Sven. I'm co-opting her handle. I have a question. Are you tracking members of these radicalized groups that are becoming embedded in the police departments and some aspects of the military?
So we haven't specifically tracked that in our data. We do, there are a number of incidents that have come up that we've tracked that are people who have either former law enforcement and military background or are active duty at the time of the attack. It's not something that we've pulled out specifically in our analysis yet, but it is something that there's been a lot of conversation about. I know that there are a lot of folks in the government and in the military who are very concerned about this and looking especially at ways that they can make sure that they don't have a large spread of radicalization. Part of the concern there is that it's something that's really hard to track, especially from the outside. So for instance, with our data, we could look at the number of incidents of our universe of total terrorist attacks that were perpetrated by someone with a military or law enforcement background or affiliation, but we can't really look at the universe of people who are in law enforcement or in the military who might harbor these beliefs. And so that's one really hard way of being able to track that. But it is something that a lot of people are concerned about. And it is something that's particularly interesting to look at when you're looking with some of the far right groups, particularly the militia groups, at the way that past experience in the military or in law enforcement is treated within their communities. So most of the militia groups are anti-police. One of the big exceptions is a lot of the groups that are down in the Southwest who sort of have a more favorable view of law enforcement because they particularly like the Border Patrol and they see themselves as sort of an asset to aid the Border Patrol. But overall, there is a bit more respect for the US military in these communities. And oftentimes, even looking at some of their online forums, you see people who are saying, okay, I'm looking to join a militia and here's my past military experience, as though it's sort of a credential that they can show to prove that they have something to offer the group, have some kind of training they can provide, or capabilities that they bring to the table. That said, again, it's something that we see happening in these extremist groups, but it's really hard to then be able to look more broadly at the universe of individuals in law enforcement or in the military to be able to identify, is this just a handful of cases that we notice because we see them popping up on the extremist side? How big of a widespread problem is this? So that's something that I think probably more on the government and classified side, people are looking at, and people definitely recognize that there is a need to look at it. But from the outside, it's very difficult to do so.
Yeah, I think what my concern is that in the past it might have been more covert. Now it's more overt. You're seeing examples of sheriffs in Florida who have QAnon patches, and they're right out there next to Mike Pence, and they're in a photo op, and that's going out on Twitter. So it's actually legitimating some of these fringe and radical groups in a way that seems very, very dangerous to our democracy.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the big things there, especially in building up the ability to combat extremism on the local level, is also making sure that local law enforcement is really informed about the type of threat that groups like that pose, and is able to sort of clean house internally so that, number one, they're able to actually stop and disrupt this action, and also they can maintain the community trust that's necessary to be able to do so. Particularly since a lot of the community level disruption will rely on, having the trust of the community and having people come forward if they've seen something, if they're hearing things, and especially against the backdrop of a lot of concerns about the way law enforcement operates, about police brutality. I think that it's really important to make sure that law enforcement is able to do that self-check and root out problems from within, both so that they can be effective and so that they can maintain that trust.
Yeah, and thank you.
Do you have a way of tracking what groups are buying in the spike of gun sales? Who's buying guns?
So we don't. So that that's not necessarily just extremists. That's across the country, all of the background checks that are run. So we just use that as a proxy overall for how many guns are being sold. So we can't necessarily say, what percentage was bought by people who harbor extremist views or by different groups. And again, this is one of the biggest challenges in combating domestic terrorism at this point in time, is that the biggest threat isn't coming from these organized groups that we're able to easily get, membership lists and organizational structures from. It really is this decentralized network model where people can share information and share ideas online. They can radicalize online, but no one's really reporting to one another. And a lot of the attacks we see then end up being sort of this traditional lone wolf style attack because someone has radicalized online or because they're part of this sort of loose movement. And it's much harder to then target them as a cohesive group. So we're not able to pull that out from the gun data, but we are able to use it as a proxy to see the increased focus on gaining firearms and the increased concern that the government and local law enforcement need to have in trying to combat this.
Thank you.
I have several questions. Could I just start by asking you about the Boogaloo group, whom you say are wanting a second civil war? What is their actual political agenda? I mean, they want the civil war because?
So I think largely because they're such a new movement. This is one of the biggest questions on all of our minds as researchers and in the government as well, government and law enforcement. The movement it's really a patchwork of different ideologies. The big thing that they have in common is wanting this second civil war, which is what they refer to as the Boogaloo. But there are really a lot of different subsets of people who ascribe to the movement. So some of them do hold a lot of white supremacist views, and they see it very much as sort of a racial war that's going to break out in the pursuit of an all-white society. But there are also many other subgroups that are just more broadly opposed to the police, opposed to sort of the government controlling what they can and can't do, with a lot of views that are much more similar to what we see more on the broader anti-government extremist side of protecting Second Amendment rights, of groups that disagree with taxation and contributions to broader social programs. Some overlap with things like the sovereign citizen movement of people who don't want to be governed. It really is kind of a broad catch-all group. And I think one of the things that's really aided with its recruitment has been sort of the catchiness of it and the aesthetics that they bring, as disturbing as that is to say. A lot of it is, these bright colors, the Hawaiian shirts. They have a lot of, memes and things that they share online, a lot of inside jokes in the group that really pull people in. And it's sort of as I said, these are very decentralized networks, but I think that this is a decentralized network that really gives people an identity in a very clearly defined and very visible way. And so it has a lot of draw for recruitment. But then as a result, you really are getting people who are in it for a wide variety of reasons. And so there isn't one unifying thing that brings them together, aside from the fact that, you know, they want this large scale outbreak of violence.
But they couldn't tell you why.
Well, each one individually can tell you why, but they're not all going to agree with each other.
So here's my second question. Supposing I knew of certain individuals who were stockpiling weapons and talking a language that is extremist, where would I go with that information? Supposing it's in a community where one doesn't really trust the police to take, well, you know which side they're on. Where does one go with it, that kind of concern?
You would want to reach out to the FBI.
So that leads to my third question, which is, in your view, is the FBI sufficiently funded to deal with these issues?
Yeah, I think the FBI has been doing a great job of trying to track this, trying to combat it. We've seen actually, so as I went through the data, I kept mentioning that we were tracking attacks and plots. A lot of those plots that we have included in there are things that the FBI disrupted before they were able to come to pass. There have been a lot of, you know, over the past, year and a half, 2 years, there have been quite a few high profile arrests of high up members and members who are plotting attacks in white supremacist groups like Atomwaffen and the Base. There is a robust recognition among the FBI and national law enforcement that far-right terrorists, particularly white supremacists, currently pose the greatest threat to the US. So if you look at recent reports put out by groups like the FBI, the DOJ, even some major counterterrorism state-level groups, for instance, the state of New Jersey has a really great counterterrorism office that puts out annual reports. They all agree that white supremacists pose the greatest threat to the country at this point in time. And so they really do recognize this and they're trying to combat it. And I think there is this broad recognition that because it is coming from this very decentralized level, they really do need public trust and public cooperation to help them, because, you know, you can only get so far trying to track people's online activity, particularly given a lot of the, you know, very necessary free speech and privacy protections.
So that leads me to my third and also fourth and last question, which is, do you collect evidence on retribution when people in communities do report to the FBI? The follow-up. I mean, their lives are then in danger sometimes.
Yeah, I mean,
are you watching, collecting that data?
That's not something that we're specifically looking at on our team, but that is something that, you know, the FBI takes very seriously in ensuring witness safety and ensuring that your identity is protected if you do reach out, so that, you know, they're not going to go to them and say, oh, you know, Mary reached out to us with concerns. Your identity will be protected.
Very often the group can suspect.
Yeah.
And so it's that retribution target. I mean, is there a history of that? When you say they target individuals.
Oh, okay. So when we look at the individuals category there, that's not so much people being targeted specifically. So not specifically saying, oh, John Smith was a bad guy, so now we're going to target him in this attack. That's much more sort of just private citizens going about their daily business who are targeted because of their identity. So in that category, what we're tracking is much more attacks that are broadly For instance, targeting Latinos. So the attack in El Paso at the Walmart that specifically targeted Latinos. Attacks targeting African Americans, attacks targeting women from the Int'l movement, attacks against people because they're Jewish or because they're Muslim, attacks like that that are based on identity, not based on the specific individual person.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yes. And I'm also pulling up here, just back to your question on sort of the government's broad recognition of this threat. Just reiterating that it really is sort of the unanimous opinion at this point in time that far-right individuals, far-right extremists, and especially white supremacists pose the greatest threat. I have a quote here from the Department of Homeland Security's Homeland Threat Assessment that was just released last month in October 2020. And their conclusion specifically was, quote, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, will remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. So as much as I think some of the big stories you hear on the news are about a lot of fear from left-wing individuals, we had the administration calling for Antifa to be designated as a terrorist organization, which that's a separate topic to get into, but they are not a group that really can be designated. It's a very loose network of people who ascribe to the same ideology, some of whom use violent means. You know, despite a lot of that, a lot of those more newsworthy, not newsworthy, but attention-grabbing news headlines focused on that. I think across government and across law enforcement that's really looking at intelligence collection and threat assessment, it is, as far as I've seen, the unanimous opinion that far-right extremists, particularly white supremacists, do pose the greatest threat. And that's where a lot of the attention should be given in the coming years.
Anyone else with a question? Well, I have a question, Catrina. So
Yeah.
when is a threat a threat? And what I mean more specifically, you know, you've got these groups that we've seen, you know, in the state houses with automatic weapons now, or semi-automatic weapons. Now, I understand possession of those weapons in those states loaded apparently is legal in public. Now, it would be very different in Connecticut and Massachusetts, since many of those weapons are not legal. But I sort of guarantee if 8 people showed up anywhere in Connecticut or Massachusetts, and probably a lot of other places, not one person, but 8 people with a loaded weapon, there'd be a SWAT team in 5 minutes. So how is that, you know, different? How is that not a threat? Because in my perception, it would be a threat. Yeah, well, I think you get the basis of my question.
Yeah, and that's a really hard line to draw in general. And, you know, from a legal law enforcement perspective, I think a lot of it would come down to things like, what are the local open carry laws and things like that? Have they made an explicit threat, or is it just their presence there? And so what kind of our approach as we're coding things when we talk about our definition being the use or threat of violence is sort of a threat with an imminent violent outcome. So a lot of the threats that we included are things like calling in a bomb threat to a crowded courthouse in session. Things like pointing a gun at protesters and threatening to shoot them for political purposes. Again, having to fit all of those different criteria. And so kind of across all of our coding, we applied a very strict standard in terms of making sure that we had clear evidence of the motive, clear evidence that it truly was meant as a threat. And so I think there's a lot of room for discussion and debate over where you draw those lines. We chose to be sort of relatively cautious in making sure that there was a pretty high standard of evidence for including things. But I think that it's a conversation that's worth having moving forward, especially as we see things like the armed protest in Michigan earlier this year, where they ended up shutting down a session of the state legislature. And actually there was a similar incident a couple of years ago in Oregon, where armed protesters were able to get a session of the state legislature canceled after they showed up to protest with their weapons. Something like that is still, as long as they're legally carrying those weapons, it is still technically protected by law. And we wouldn't include that in our data set, but I think that there is a lot of room for a healthy debate around sort of where we draw the line there and how we continue to enforce the ability of the government to function as it needs to and for the free exchange of ideas in government, while not allowing someone exercising their freedom of speech to then prevent others from doing the same, or to prevent operations of government as are necessary in those cases. It is notable that now it's been proven that several of the men who are responsible for the plot in Michigan to kidnap the governor were actually present at those protests at the Michigan State House. They're actually featured in many of the photos that we have from there. And so I think that also shows that there is, at least to some degree, overlap in the people who are using that type of protest technique and the people who will follow through with more direct violent action. And so that's something that definitely, I think, needs to continue to be tracked and monitored. But it's also something where, there's always this balance between security and ensuring the First Amendment, so that you're not just limiting the protest rights of people that you disagree with, and to ensure that everyone's able to exercise their rights in a way that doesn't actively threaten others. Unfortunately, I don't have a good solution to how we do that, but I think it's a conversation that is ongoing and that people definitely recognize as a problem, especially as we continue to see these armed groups and paramilitary groups who are sort of specifically demonstrating in ways that affect the political process, using the implied threat from being armed. I think it's an outstanding question that I don't have a good answer to.
Thank you. Anyone else have a burning question or a non-burning question?
Yeah, hi. I was just curious. During the first presidential debate, I believe it was the first one, President Trump publicly called out in support of the Proud Boys. Is that a recognized terrorist organization, just for curiosity?
So the US actually does not designate domestic terrorist organizations. We have a foreign terrorist designation. And so groups operating in the US, there isn't the option to have them designated as a formal terrorist organization or not. The Proud Boys are an extremist group. They fit under sort of this broader umbrella of paramilitary groups, often involved in a lot of street violence. They're present at a lot of these protests, and they do kind of fall under this far-right umbrella. We've seen some of their members involved in terrorist actions. However, they're honestly not one of the bigger groups that's out there, but they are one of the groups that's operating, one of the groups that's been present at a lot of the demonstrations, particularly in the past year and the past couple years, with heavily armed presence, and they do pose a threat. And they and other far-right extremists really celebrated President Trump's comments during that debate. And I think that highlights overall the care that public officials need to take in what they say, because extremists, particularly those who have felt emboldened by the different policies of the Trump administration and by some of the comments that he's made, by conspiracy theories such as QAnon that holds certain people in the government, including Trump himself, in sort of a position of reverence. government officials need to be conscious of the effect that their words have, and that statements like that lend perceived legitimacy to actions of extremists. We see now in the wake of the election results that there are some far-right groups, including some of the militia groups, that have talked about this idea that, you know, in January, after lawsuits pan out, they'll look for a signal that it's time to act, including looking for such a signal from people in the Trump administration, including Trump himself, to prevent a Biden presidency. And so I think there is a lot of scrutiny paid to the language that public officials, especially in high seats of power, statements that they make and encouragements that they give, whether that's an actually given encouragement or just something that is taken that way. And I think that we really need officials to be conscious of that and to de-escalate their language to not further inflame political tensions in the country. And I hope that moving forward, as we move out of this election season, as we move into the Biden administration, I hope that we really can tone down the rhetoric and not continue to grant legitimacy to these groups.
Thank you.
Catrina, I find it absolutely fascinating that the Department of Homeland Security can report that right-wing extremist groups are the major threat to this country. I mean, I don't know if you said major domestic threat or just simply the major threat to this country. That is one portion of the Department of Homeland Security. What about the department as a whole? What about the secretary? What about access to the president and you know, these public officials of note? What kind of what can I say? I'm talking about checks and balances. What kind of cautionary remarks can have been made, are being made, but have any you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Traction.
I cannot pretend to speak for the thought processes that have been going on in the administration. I know that we've had some former officials coming out of DHS, as well as some of the other agencies, who have alleged that there was a lot of pushback and suppression around a lot of these reports and some of this analysis. I can't speak to the credibility of any of that if that has happened, but I do think that we've certainly seen sort of on the national stage, including in tweets, where the president is promoting and elevating a lot of QAnon theories, a lot of conspiracy theories, continuing this claim that the election was illegitimate despite all evidence to the contrary. His comments at the first debate that we just talked about, and refusal to openly reject some of these extremist groups, regardless of what the thought process has been behind that. I think that has further emboldened a lot of these groups. And I think that is a sustained challenge that we need to focus on, and that I hope that
Department of Homeland Security not all over him. I mean, he's the #1 terrorist in this country, isn't he?
I mean, I cannot try to speak for thought processes of folks in government, but I think we've certainly seen the impact of their refusal to openly condemn this and openly act against it, to try to tone down some of the messaging that's going to the more extreme supporters. And I think that, you know, you can draw conclusions from there about priorities.
Thank you for engaging with me on that.
Well, Catrina, unless there's anyone else with something really important to ask, I think we should conclude this. Really appreciate your presentation and taking the time and answering all these questions. Just thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. This is fun.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we'll say good night to everyone. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Lawrence, for
Thank you.
organizing.
You're welcome.
Thank you.